I recognize the member for Ottawa Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise today to speak to Bill 98, the Building Homes and Improving Transportation Infrastructure Act of 2026. Two things I agree with: building homes and improving transportation infrastructure. But I do want to begin just by putting this bill into the context of this week's budget bill and the other housing announcements from the Minister. You know, in my riding of Ottawa Centre, I hear from constituents really who are doing everything right and still cannot find stable housing. I hear from tenants working full-time, still spending more than half of their income on rent, trying to keep up as costs rise. I hear from renters facing above-guideline increases that they simply cannot afford in a system where the landlord and tenant board backlog leaves them with nowhere to turn. And I hear from young people, as I'm sure many of you do, have given up on never ever being able to buy a home in the city or the neighborhood they grew up in. And I hear from people waiting years for affordable housing with no clear sense of when things will change. And that is the reality that this week's housing announcements and Bill 98 must respond to. So, Speaker, before we assess this bill, we need to understand the system that it is operating within, because the pressures we are seeing today did not appear overnight. 4 years ago, this Premier stood in front of cameras and made a promise that his government would build 1.5 million homes by 2031. He said it at every campaign stop. He used it to justify overriding municipalities, rewriting the Greenbelt rules, handing developers billions in fee relief and legislative shortcuts. But then last week, the housing minister told reporters, and I'm quoting directly, "I don't wake up thinking about 1.5. So we are being asked to abandon the homes that are required in this province. So I just want to pick up on something that my colleague was referring to, because it is really important to understand the fiscal imbalances in this country, in this province. And, you know, for decades, successive provincial governments have shifted responsibility onto municipalities without providing the revenue tools to match. Municipalities have been asked to take on more responsibility for housing, for transit, for infrastructure, for social services, but they have not been given the fiscal tools or the capacity to deliver those responsibilities in a sustainable way. There is a structural imbalance in this country between which level of government collects money and which level delivers services. The federal government collects about 44% of all tax revenues, but only delivers 35% of government services. Provinces collect about 46% and deliver about 48% of government services. But in contrast, municipalities collect 10% of revenues, but deliver 15% of all government services, and are responsible for 60% of the public infrastructure. So they collect 10% of the revenues, and they are responsible for 60%. That's the roads, the bridges, the water and wastewater, the transit systems. And the difference is made up through transfers, mostly from federal to provincial governments and then from the province to municipalities. So we know that municipalities are being asked to do too much with too few resources. Their finances are at a breaking point, and they are asking for help. Now, cities control many of the key services that we rely on, but the level of service they can provide depends on whether they get their fair share from this province. Otherwise, they have limited tools. They have property taxes, they have fees for things like recreation, service charges for water and wastewater, and development charges. Now, development charges in particular have become central to how municipalities finance growth. They are not arbitrary fees. They are how cities pay for the infrastructure that makes housing possible in the first place. Helps to build the roads, the water and wastewater systems, the transit, community services. These are all funded through development charges because municipalities in this province have been left with few alternatives. And Speaker, we agree that development charges are part of the affordability problem. And reducing costs on how we build housing is important. However, I must say that it is also worth noting that the 50% reduction that was announced earlier this week in development charges for 3 years is not in this bill. So it will be interesting to understand how that is going to be implemented. But the question here is not whether costs should come down. The question is how. Because if you remove that revenue from municipalities without replacing it in a stable and predictable way, you are not solving the problem. You are simply shifting it somewhere else in the system through higher property taxes, higher water and wastewater rates, higher service fees. And that is where there is some concern. Reducing development charges will definitely make it easier for developers to finance new home construction, and that's a good thing, which should mean more projects will become economically viable. But this does not necessarily mean that home prices will come down, especially not when we rely on a profit-maximizing market alone to deliver new housing. So the impact of the DC reductions are not clear. It will not mean mandatory cuts across the board like we saw with Bill 23. Instead, the understanding in reading this bill is that the province will identify priority municipalities and negotiate or impose agreements on them in order to reduce their development charges. I just want to read directly from the backgrounder. Canada and Ontario will also agree on a list of priority municipalities where DCs are seen as cost prohibitive and where growth is essential to support Ontario's future. Good thing. For these municipalities, Ontario would require a commitment of substantial residential reduction of DCs of between 30 to 50% for a duration of 3 years. Ontario will work to recognize municipalities that have already reduced their residential DCs, provided they maintain the reductions for a minimum of a 3-year period. Okay. So this could be a fair and reasonable reduction of DCs, or it could be imposing even more burdens on municipalities that are already at their breaking point after years and decades of provincial cuts, downloads, and unfunded mandates. Either way, it is not a permanent solution to the broken provincial-municipal fiscal relationship. And as my colleague before me mentioned, we need and we call for a new deal for municipalities that ensures that they have the resources and the powers that they need to deliver essential services and infrastructure on a permanent basis. So while the intention may be to lower costs, the risk is that those costs do not disappear, they simply show up somewhere else. I also now want to turn to the budget earlier this year and the implications there on housing. Because at the same time that we have this bill in front of us, we're seeing a reduction in provincial investment. The Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing is being cut by $347 million in the budget they released days ago. So municipalities, again, are being asked to do more with fewer tools and less support. That is not a coordinated housing strategy. It is a continuation of the very pattern that created these pressures in the first place. And Speaker, this matters even more when we look at the current state of housing in Ontario, because the system is simply not keeping up. According to CMHC, Ontario recorded just 62,561 housing starts in 2025. That is fully a third lower than just 3 years ago. And the 2026 budget projects that it will get worse before it gets better, with 64,800 starts this year. That's barely moving from last year's floor. To stay on track for 1.5 million homes as promised, Ontario needs roughly 175,000 starts per year. And we are getting fewer than 65,000. That is 37% of what is needed. And let's be clear, this is a made-in-Ontario problem. Quebec is building housing. Nova Scotia is building. The prairie provinces, with a combined population of just 5 million people, are building nearly as many homes as we are. So something has gone catastrophically wrong in this province, and it happened under this government's watch. So, Speaker, I just want to be clear again. We do support reducing costs for home buyers. Development charges and HST relief should absolutely be part of a broader housing strategy. And as my colleague again mentioned and was reported, the one very positive piece is removing the imposition of limits on how small a parcel of land can be for building a home. Now, when we think about municipalities and existing infrastructure and ensuring that housing can continue to be built in areas that are already serviced, already have the roads, already have the water and wastewater, already have the stormwater management, have the transit. We have got to start building infill. We cannot continue to sprawl. Not only does it cost far too much initially, but years down the road, when that infrastructure has to be maintained and replaced, that is what is going to bankrupt municipalities in this province. So I do hope, it does remain to be seen if this will actually be implemented. Because we had in 2022 Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force, this government's own experts, one of the key recommendations was to limit exclusionary zoning in municipalities and allow as of right residential housing up to 4 units and 4 stories. But they didn't do it. They listened to people who said, look, I live in a low-rise single-family home and I don't want 4 people living beside me. Well, Speaker, if we are going to build sustainable municipalities, if we are going to live in a province where people have housing, if we're going to live in a province where people can buy a home, if we're going to live in a province where people are not losing their housing and falling into homelessness, Speaker, we have to get serious about how we allow development and where we allow development to happen. And the measures in this bill also coupled with this week's budget and other housing announcements, doesn't necessarily guarantee that. Now, I want to talk also about the HST holiday while I have 5 minutes left. Again, I questioned this the other day. The HST holiday, as you know, is a one-year measure, and the government has described it as a sale. Housing development operates a multi-year timeline, so this does not and cannot meaningfully support new construction. With 1 year on an HST holiday, what will happen is that good news for the people who are going to buy a new home, whether it's their first, second, third, or fourth, a new home in the next year, good news for them, they're not going to pay HST. But that does not spur new construction. To get new homes built is a multi-year initiative. So this primarily helps move existing inventory. And the issue here is not, the idea of reducing costs. It's an approach that is designed to help developers offload their existing inventory, mostly condos here in Toronto. So what you're doing with this HST holiday is you're actually putting a floor for investors and developers so that their stock doesn't tumble too much. So not allowing that affordability that we continue to hear will happen with supply. So there's nothing in here for renters, nothing for people on wait lists, nothing for those at risk of homelessness. And I'm not exactly certain why the High Art capital deal didn't receive more attention. It's actually a $300 million deal to convert 2,200 unsold condos into long-term rentals. And again, it is a bailout. I just want to say also that I'm going to be sharing my time with the member from London North Centre. So this bill doesn't strengthen the non-market sector, and it does not recognize that housing is not just about how quickly we build, but who we are building for. And Speaker, we all agree that we need to build more homes. We agree that costs need to come down, but if those costs are not properly accounted for, they do not disappear. They are simply pushed somewhere else in the system. And while the government was announcing its HST rebate in front of the cameras and DC reductions in their budget, again, something else was happening in these budget documents. The Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing budget has been cut again by over $344 million. The government attributes this to a reduction in what it calls time-limited investments, but those are budget language for housing programs. So we'll have to wait, I guess, for estimates to know exactly which programs are being cut, but housing programs are being cut during a housing crisis. We'll ask the questions at estimates. Last time I asked questions at estimates, I'd never got an answer, so this time I'll figure out how to get that answer out of the government. But it is really quite alarming that we have that kind of a budget cut happening. So, we've got a bill here, Bill 98, that purports to build faster, hopefully, but we want to make sure that it builds smarter and it reduces costs, but that it doesn't shift those costs onto municipalities and onto taxpayers, and that it doesn't continue to rely on a market that is already failing. Ontarians deserve a real plan. They deserve one that also invests in non-market housing, one that supports municipalities with stable funding, because housing is not just an investment, Speaker, it is home for people. And unless we understand that everyone in our province deserves to be housed, whether you are buying a home, whether you are renting, whether you are in a shelter today or living unhoused or unsheltered today, you deserve a home. It is a human right, and I do hope that we will continue to work to ensure that everyone has that home. Thank you, Speaker.